You use GPS every single day for driving directions, for delivery apps, for the little blue dot on your phone showing exactly where you are, and you have never paid a single dollar for it. No subscription, no ad, no premium tier. Here's what nobody tells you. The satellite that makes that possible just cost someone $257 million, and you're not the one who paid for it. I pulled this from real GAO government audits, actual Space Force contract announcements, and GPS.gov's own official numbers, so this isn't a guess. Most people assume the hard part of owning a GPS satellite is the rocket science. It isn't. The hard part is figuring out who's actually paying the bill, because it's definitely not you. This matters right now because the US just finished building its most advanced GPS satellite ever, and it launched only months ago. You don't need any space or government background to follow this. I'll explain everything in plain language. This all comes down to something called the Program Acquisition Unit Cost, which is just a fancy way of saying the real price once you stop hiding the extra costs. I'll show you what one of these satellites actually costs, who's really footing the bill, and the government program tied to all of this that just got canceled after spending over $6 billion trying to fix a computer system. Let's start with the number on the sticker, because even that alone is bigger than most people would guess. In 2026, the US Space Force awarded a contract for 2 new GPS satellites built by Lockheed Martin for a combined $514.4 million. Divide that in half, and you get roughly $257 million for a single satellite. Lockheed Martin is the main company building today's GPS satellites, the same way Boeing used to build older generations of them. Back in 2018, the Space Force gave Lockheed Martin a deal worth up to $2 billion for as many as 22 of these satellites, and by 2026, the government had exercised its options on 14 of them, worth about $4.6 billion total. But here's the part that most people miss completely. That $257 million number is just the price for building the physical satellite. It doesn't include everything the government actually spends to get that satellite into space and keep it working. Government auditors have a separate number for that, called the Program Acquisition Unit Cost, and it's simply the total cost of the entire program, research, development, testing, everything, divided evenly across every satellite built. Think of it like buying a house. The sticker price on the listing might be $250,000, but once you add the cost of the land it sits on, the roads built to reach it, and the years of planning that went into the neighborhood, the real cost per house looks very different. According to a government audit, GPS-3's real program acquisition unit cost came out to somewhere between $534 and $583 million per satellite, more than double the number Lockheed Martin quotes for building just the spacecraft itself, and that number kept climbing. The GPS-3 program originally planned for 8 satellites at an estimated cost of about $4.275 billion. By the time auditors checked again, the program had grown to 10 satellites and $5.834 billion, a 36% increase in the total estimated cost. The first satellite in that program was originally supposed to launch in April of 2014. It didn't actually reach orbit until 4 years later in 2018, largely because of technical problems with its navigation equipment. Lockheed Martin was even forced to forfeit around $70 million in fees on those first satellites because of parts testing failures. And building the satellite is only step one. Launching it costs extra. Back in 2018, the Space Force awarded SpaceX a contract worth $6 million just to launch 3 GPS-3 missions, which works out to roughly $96.9 million per launch, and later missions have landed in a similar range, typically somewhere between $82.7 million and $96.5 million per mission on a rocket like SpaceX's Falcon 9. That's a separate bill, on top of everything Lockheed Martin already charged to build the satellite in the first place. Add it all up, and getting one working GPS satellite into orbit, from design to launch, realistically runs somewhere in the range of $300 million on the cheap end, to well over $500 million once every real cost is counted. So here's the question that should be bothering you by now. If a single satellite costs hundreds of millions of dollars and there are dozens of them in orbit right now, where does all that money actually come from if nobody's charging you a subscription to use your phone's map app? The answer is that you were never the customer. GPS.gov, the US government's own official page for the system, states plainly that GPS is funded almost entirely through the Department of Defense budget, paid for by US taxpayers, with some additional civilian support coming from the Department of Transportation. There is no GPS subscription fee, no paywall, no premium tier. The free navigation signal on your phone is essentially a side effect of a system that was built for an entirely different customer, the US military. Modern GPS-3 satellites carry something called M-code, a stronger, harder to jam military signal designed for precision-guided weapons, aircraft, ships, and troop navigation. The consumer-grade GPS signal on your phone rides along on the same satellite almost as an afterthought, a free civilian benefit attached to a system whose real purpose is national defense. And here's the ownership structure that surprises most people. Lockheed Martin The company that physically builds these satellites does not own them. Not even close. The satellites belong entirely to the United States government. Once built, a satellite is handed over to the US Space Force, specifically a unit called Space Delta 8, part of a larger organization called Mission Delta 31, which runs day-to-day operations from Schriever Space Force Base in Colorado, using something called the Master Control Station, along with monitoring antennas positioned around the world to track every satellite in real time. A separate unit called Space Systems Command handles the acquisition and contracting side, essentially playing the role of the government's purchasing department for space hardware, deciding which company gets which contract and negotiating the terms. A third group, Space Operations Command, oversees the actual day-to-day running of the system once it's operational. 3 separate government organizations, each responsible for a different slice of a system that a private company only gets to build, never own. Lockheed Martin's job ends at delivery, though the company does get paid separately to help keep the satellites running. In 2022, Space Systems Command awarded Lockheed Martin a $147.7 million 10-year contract just to provide ongoing support for the GPS satellites already in orbit, covering several older generations of the constellation at once. So the real structure looks like this. US taxpayers fund the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense funds Space Force procurement. Space Force pays Lockheed Martin to build the satellite and SpaceX or United Launch Alliance to launch it, and then Space Force operates it forever, all so that you can get free turn-by-turn directions to a coffee shop. GPS isn't the only system like this in the sky, and understanding why tells you exactly how high the stakes really are. There are 3 other major global navigation networks operating right now, and each one exists for the same underlying reason. No major power wants to depend on a rival nation's satellites to guide its own missiles, ships, or economy. The European Union runs Galileo, a system explicitly built so Europe wouldn't have to depend on another country's satellites for its own navigation and timing needs. Galileo is designed to be civilian-controlled from the ground up, and its newer high-accuracy service can pinpoint a location down to roughly 20 centimeters, tighter than the standard GPS signal most phones use. Russia runs GLONASS, restored back to full strength with around 24 active satellites after a rough period following the fall of the Soviet Union, treated as a matter of national sovereignty that Russia was never willing to outsource to anyone else. And China runs Beidou, now the largest of all 4 systems with around 45 satellites, spread across multiple types of orbits at once, offering two-way messaging capability that GPS doesn't have, letting users send short text messages through the satellite network itself in places with no cell coverage, and serving as a strategic tool tied to China's broader Belt and Road economic initiatives across Asia, Africa, and beyond. China has publicly described Beidou as being built independently to support its own national security and economic development, without needing to lean on anyone else's infrastructure. None of these 4 countries want their military or economy dependent on a navigation system controlled by someone else, especially not during a potential conflict, when an adversary could theoretically degrade or deny that signal entirely. That single fact turns GPS from a convenient app feature into a genuine piece of geopolitical infrastructure, sitting at the center of a quiet global competition between 4 major powers, each spending billions of dollars to make sure they're never the one left without a working signal. Now here's the case study that shows exactly how expensive it can get when this kind of government space program goes wrong. Building the satellites themselves is only half of the GPS system. The other half is the ground control software that actually runs the whole network, tracking every satellite, sending it commands, and managing the entire constellation from the ground. And in 2010, the government awarded a contract to modernize that ground system, called OCX, short for Next Generation Operational Control System, to Raytheon, now known as RTX. The original deal was worth about $3.7 billion, with delivery expected around 2016. That deadline came and went. By 2026, 16 years after the contract was signed, the program's cost had ballooned to somewhere between $6.3 and $8 billion, more than double the original estimate, still a decade behind schedule and plagued by repeated software failures, serious enough to trigger what's called a Nunn-McCurdy breach, a formal legal threshold in the US. Defense law that flags a program as dangerously over budget and forces Congress to review whether it should continue at all. In April of 2026, the Space Force finally terminated the contract entirely, citing what it called insurmountable technical issues that were putting the current GPS system's basic capabilities at risk. Instead of pushing forward with the new software, the government fell back on continuing to patch and modernize its older ground control software, called the Architecture Evolution Plan, awarding Lockheed Martin a separate $105 million task order just to keep that older system limping along for a while longer. Think about what that actually means. A company spent 16 years and up to $8 billion trying to build new software to control satellites that already existed and were already working, and in the end, the government simply gave up and went back to the old system it was trying to replace in the first place. That cancellation happened in the same year as one of GPS's biggest milestones, which makes the timing genuinely strange when you sit with it. On April 21st of 2026, the Space Force launched the final satellite in the GPS-3 program, officially called GPS-38 or SV-10, riding on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket. The Space Force described it as completing the strongest, most resilient GPS constellation the country has ever had, bringing the total number of active satellites up to 32, well above the 24 satellites the system technically needs to function worldwide, giving the network a real cushion of spare capacity. That final satellite carried genuinely new technology on board, including a new space-qualified atomic clock, the precision timing device that GPS depends on to calculate your exact location down to a matter of feet, a laser reflector array that lets ground stations track its position with extreme accuracy, an experimental crosslink communication payload that lets satellites talk directly to each other, instead of always routing everything through a ground station first, and even a 3D printed antenna, a manufacturing approach that's still relatively rare in space hardware built to this level of reliability. The Space Force also noted something unusual about the mission that had nothing to do with the hardware itself. It managed to rearrange the entire launch schedule in under 7 weeks, a process that has traditionally taken far longer to coordinate across rockets, range safety, and payload readiness. A small sign that even a program this large and government-run is being pushed to move faster than it used to. Right at the same moment, a 16-year, multi-billion-dollar software program was being shut down as a failure. So here's what all of this actually means for the future of the system. GPS-3 satellites are designed to last about 15 years, which is roughly 25% longer than the satellites they replaced. But in practice, some older satellites have kept working for more than 25 years, well past their original design life, because replacing a working satellite is expensive and risky. So the Space Force tends to keep squeezing extra years out of the ones already in orbit, rather than retire them on schedule. Across the whole constellation, the average satellite age has crept up to around 13 years. That's exactly why the constellation currently sits at 32 satellites instead of the bare minimum of 24. Extra satellites act as backup capacity, a buffer against the day one of the older ones finally fails without warning. And because both jamming, which blocks a GPS signal outright, and spoofing, which tricks a receiver into reading a fake location, have become bigger concerns in recent years, especially in active conflict zones, the Space Force has started exploring a cheaper alternative model, sometimes called resilient GPS, using smaller, less expensive satellites priced around $50 to $80 million each, roughly a fifth of the cost of a full GPS-3 spacecraft, with a shorter, roughly 5-year lifespan, designed to be launched more often and in greater numbers, making the whole constellation harder to disable, since taking out any single cheaper satellite matters far less to the overall network than knocking out one of the expensive, long-lived ones. This is a permanent, ongoing government program, not a one-time purchase you make and forget about. Build a satellite, launch it, operate it for around 15 years while quietly starting to plan its replacement years in advance, then repeat the entire process again, indefinitely, funded the same way it always has been, by taxpayers who will never see an itemized bill for a service they use for free every single day without ever knowing what it actually costs to keep running. So here's the ownership verdict on a GPS satellite. Capital intensity, 10 out of 10, since even a single spacecraft runs $257 million before launch costs, and the full program cost per satellite climbs past $500 million once every real expense is counted in. Regulatory and legal risk, 10 out of 10, because you can't actually own one of these at all. This entire system exists exclusively as US government military infrastructure, built under defense contracts that a private citizen or company could never simply buy into. Margin stability, 3 out of 10 for the government's own budget. Given that the GPS-3 program alone grew by 36% past its original cost estimate, and the OCX ground software program overran by billions of dollars over 16 years before being canceled outright as a total loss. Structural moat, 10 out of 10, because building and operating a full global navigation constellation is something only a small handful of national governments on Earth have ever managed to do, and even wealthy private companies with billions in cash have never attempted to build a competing system from scratch. Overall ownership verdict, this isn't really a business you can own at all, and that's exactly the point worth remembering. You're not the customer, and you never were. The customer is the US government, And the free navigation signal reaching your phone right now is just the leftover benefit of a system built for a completely different reason: military precision, not convenience for the person trying to find the nearest coffee shop. Every time your phone finds your location in under a second, that's the tail end of a supply chain running through Lockheed Martin Space Systems Command and a Falcon 9 rocket, none of which you ever paid a cent toward directly. If this kind of thing is genuinely interesting to you, hit subscribe, because this channel exists to explain exactly this: the hidden money behind the systems you use every single day without ever thinking about who's actually paying for them. Thank you.